There is a thirst that no river can quench, no bottle can fill. It is not the thirst of the body, but of the soul, a hunger for the forgotten wholeness from which we were torn at birth. In the silence of midnight, when the world sleeps and the self is left alone with its longing, that thirst speaks. It is ancient, older than the scars of childhood, older even than your name. It is the whisper of the self, the eternal center, calling you back. But when that call is misheard, it becomes something darker. Instead of seeking the living water of meaning, a man may reach for the liquid fire in the glass. In the shimmer of amber, he sees not whiskey, but false promise, a counterfeit light, a quick and bitter sacrament. It burns its way down, promising to silence the ache, to blur the edges of pain. But this is no true baptism. It is a drowning in slow motion. Carl Jung once said, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. We must understand what lies beneath the craving. The bottle is never the root. It is the symptom. What lies beneath is the shadow of an unmet God. And so the drinker drinks, not for pleasure, but for relief. Relief from the unbearable distance between his fractured self and the divine fullness he cannot name. In every sip, he is trying unconsciously to return home. But each glass takes him further from the door. The hidden thirst is not for intoxication, it is for the sacred. And until that is understood, the cure will always remain just out of reach. In Latin, the word spiritus means both spirit and breath. It speaks of life's animating force, the invisible essence that moves through all living things. In ancient rites, wine was not a mere beverage. It was the blood of the mums, a sacred bridge between the earthbound and the divine. Shared in ritual, it carried the implication of communion, not just with the community, but with the unseen world. Yet in the modern soul, alcohol has become something else entirely. No longer a true sacrament, it has transformed into a counterfeit spirit, a hollow stand-in for the genuine breath of life. What was once symbolic of divine union has been stripped of its sacred context, leaving only the shell, the empty ritual, divorced from its source of meaning. When a man lifts the glass to his lips, he is not merely lifting a drink. Whether he knows it or not, he is raising an unconscious chalice. Somewhere deep in his bones, in the marrow of ancestral memory, he recalls the posture of worship. His fingers curve around the vessel as a priest would cradle the cup at Mass. His lips meet the rim as though to receive something consecrated, something that will bridge the distance between himself and the divine. But what flows in is not the living water that nourishes the soul. It is a fire that burns the altar down. Carl Jung saw this with chilling clarity. When chronic alcoholics came to him for help, he rarely began with the drink itself. He began with the longing that the drink sought to imitate. For him, the craving was never simply for intoxication. It was for transcendence, for a momentary escape from the prison of the self into something larger, something eternal. The danger lies in alcohol's perfect disguise. It mimics, with uncanny precision, the psychological and physiological signatures of spiritual awakening. The first sips loosen the ego's tight grip. Inhibitions dissolve. The colors of the room seem sharper. The voice grows freer. Laughter flows without restraint. For a fleeting moment, the drinker feels liberated, as if the bars of the inner prison have been pulled open and the air of freedom is rushing in. But unlike genuine spiritual ecstasy, alcohol leaves the inner architecture of the soul untouched. The prison is unchanged. The bars have only been painted gold for the night. The chains have been covered in flowers, but by morning the rust has bitten deeper into the metal. This is why the false spirit is so dangerously seductive. It offers the illusion of transcendence without the demand for transformation. It grants access to altered states without requiring the painful, humbling work of integration. And so the drinker returns night after night to the same false altar, seeking the same elevation, unaware that the ladder he climbs is nailed to the floor. In Jungian terms, this is the shadow's masquerade. The unconscious, aware of the soul's hunger for communion, dresses up a parody of it and offers it as the real thing. The shadow knows how to appeal to the deepest longings of the human heart, but twists them into a form that keeps the seeker forever circling the same barren ground. And that is why this parody is so perilous. It feels almost right. and almost can bind a man for decades. The intoxicated state mimics the early stages of mystical experience: dissolution of boundaries, a sense of unity, the lifting of fear. But it is unstable, unsustainable. Without the grounding of the self, without the integration of the unconscious, it collapses into emptiness. The soul is left more fractured than before, more estranged from the very wholeness it seeks. When the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous wrote to Jung, describing the hopelessness of chronic alcoholics, he responded with a clarity few dared to voice. The cure is not more willpower, nor the substitution of one chemical for another. The cure lies in a vital spiritual experience, an encounter with something greater than oneself. Only the true spirit can displace the false spirit. Jung was not speaking in metaphor. To him, the spirit of alcohol was an archetypal force, a psychic entity that had taken possession of the drinker. It could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or controlled by mere effort. It had to be met with an even greater force, the numinous, the divine, the eternal self. And that is the tragedy. Many will die with the chalice still in their hands, never having tasted the wine they truly sought. Their lives end in the grip of the false spirit, their thirst unquenched, their longing unmet. The path forward, then, is not simply to put down the glass. That is only the beginning. The deeper work is to learn to drink from another well, the one hidden in the heart. For there is a spirit that intoxicates without harm, that dissolves the ego yet leaves the soul whole, that burns without consuming. This is the spirit that gives life, not takes it, that awakens, not numbs, that integrates, not fractures. It does not come from the bottle. It comes from the eternal breath, spiritus, that was there before the first sip and will be there after the last. It waits in the stillness, in the depths beneath the hunger, ready to give the only drink that truly satisfies. On the surface, a drink seems simple: liquid, glass, hand, mouth. But beneath that simplicity, in the deep waters of the psyche, another transaction takes place, one that is darker, older, and far more dangerous than it appears. For the chronic drinker, alcohol is not merely a beverage. It is an emissary of the shadow. In Jung's language, the shadow is the sum of all that the ego refuses to acknowledge: the unspoken rage, the unwept grief, the unlived desires, the shameful impulses, the memories we dare not revisit. It is the totality of what we exile to the unconscious because its presence threatens our carefully crafted self-image. But the shadow does not vanish. Nothing in the psyche truly disappears. What is repressed is not destroyed. It waits, and it waits with the patience of a predator, biding its time until the gates are unguarded. Alcohol is one of its master keys. The first glass does not merely loosen a person in the social sense. It loosens the bindings that keep the shadow chained in the depths. With each sip, the latch on the door grows weaker, the hinges creak, the air changes, and then, from behind that door, the darker figures begin to step forward. Sometimes they emerge as a sudden boldness, the shy becoming brash, the cautious becoming reckless. Sometimes they wear the mask of humor, a laughter that hides cruelty, a joke with a blade concealed inside. At other times, they appear as harsh and cutting words, as lust that knows no boundaries, as grief that pours out without end. And this is why the bottom of the glass is never truly empty, not in a psychological sense. For the drinker who dares to stare into it too long, there is always something looking back. Not the friendly reflection of the self they show the world, but a distorted twin, the rejected self, the unloved shadow. The tragedy is not that alcohol reveals the shadow. In Jung's work, meeting the shadow is essential to the process of becoming whole. The tragedy is that alcohol reveals it without any of the conditions necessary for transformation, without light, without structure, without the courage and consciousness to integrate what is found. Instead of becoming an initiation into greater self-knowledge, it becomes a possession. The drinker does not meet the shadow as an equal in dialogue. He is overtaken by it, consumed by the very forces that were meant to be assimilated into his being. Here lies the crucial difference between the ritual of depth psychology and the ritual of the bar. In the analyst's office, the shadow is invited into the room under the guidance of light, contained, observed, named, and gradually reconciled with the conscious self. In the bar, it is summoned in darkness, surrounded by noise, obscured in the fog of intoxication. One setting has the potential to heal, the other corrodes from the inside out. The shadow, however, has a paradoxical mercy. For all its fearsome appearance, it does not wish for us to remain strangers to ourselves forever. It will continue to appear again and again, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in strange attractions and sudden bursts of anger. And for some, night after night, it will appear in the bottom of the glass. It would rather terrify us with its face than let us persist in the shallow comfort of denial. It is the bearer of truths too heavy for the unprepared mind, yet essential for the soul that seeks to live fully. But here is the most difficult truth. The shadow will not be satisfied by being glimpsed in passing. It will not be integrated by accident. To meet it as a liberating force rather than a destructive one requires that we approach it with intention, sobriety, and the willingness to endure its discomfort. Without this, the meeting at the bottom of the glass is nothing more than a dangerous flirtation, a nightly summoning that leaves the drinker more fragmented, more estranged, and more dependent on the ritual that is slowly unmaking them. And yet, the shadow's patience is eternal. It knows that one day, whether in this life or another, the soul will have to drink, not the false spirit that numbs and forgets, but the bitter medicine of truth that heals and transforms. Until then, it waits. The modern mind clings to willpower as if it were a talisman, a charm to ward off every demon, every weakness. We are told from childhood that if we simply decide hard enough, try long enough, resist fiercely enough, we can bend the world and ourselves into any shape we wish. But in the language of the psyche, willpower is a fragile thing, a candle in the wind, its flame flickering against forces far older and far more powerful than the conscious mind. Carl Jung understood this with a kind of brutal clarity. The alcoholic is not defeated because he lacks discipline in the conventional sense. Many alcoholics are disciplined in other areas of life, in work, in endurance, in certain obligations. The defeat comes because the force that enslaves him does not dwell in the bright, rational realm where willpower operates. Addiction lives in the underworld of the psyche, the same labyrinth where the gods and monsters sleep. In myth, this is the realm of Hades, the territory of shadow and archetype. The conscious mind, with its neat logic and tidy plans, is a stranger here. And when it enters unprepared, it is overwhelmed. Willpower fights on the wrong battlefield. It is the knight who charges bravely against a shadow only to discover that his sword passes harmlessly through mist. The more he swings, the more he tires. The shadow remains. In the language of alchemy, the ego is the prima materiam, the raw, unrefined substance at the beginning of the great work. Willpower tries to harden this crude material into gold through sheer force, hammering without understanding. But true alchemy is not brute work. It is the slow marriage of opposites, fire and water, light and shadow, spirit and matter. Without the full process, without the dissolution, the purification, the integration, the ego does not transform. It simply cracks under the strain. This is why white-knuckling sobriety so often fails. The alcoholic may grip the steering wheel of his life until his hands bleed, determined to keep the car from swerving back into destruction. But all the while, the shadow self rides in the passenger seat, whispering in his ear. The more the ego resists, the more the shadow adapts, finding new cracks in the armor to seep through. In myth, the hero who tries to slay the dragon with brute strength always falls. The successful hero first descends into the dragon's lair, learns its language, understands its power, and ultimately transforms the beast into an ally. This is the deep truth of addiction. You cannot kill it by force. You must integrate the power it holds hostage. Jung once told an alcoholic patient, "You are in the grip of a spirit more powerful than you are. Only a greater spirit can release you." This was not a metaphor. For Jung, the spirit of alcohol was a living archetypal possession, a psychic entity clothed in liquid form. The drinker was not simply indulging a bad habit. He was in a relationship with a numinous force that had claimed a part of his soul. This is the truth most people refuse to face. The cure is not more will. The cure is surrender, not to the bottle, but to something higher, something vast enough to contend with the archetype itself. Such surrender is not weakness. It is the recognition that the battle must be fought on a higher plane than the ego can reach. It is the act of laying down the sword before the true king, the self, and allowing the greater intelligence of the psyche to mediate the conflict. In Christian symbolism, this is the moment of kneeling at the altar. In alchemical terms, it is the mortificatio, the death of the old form so that a new one can be born. Willpower belongs to the realm of the ego. Recovery belongs to the realm of the soul. The ego seeks control, the soul seeks transformation. And until the ego bows to the self, until it accepts its role as servant rather than master, the cycle will continue. Each victory will be temporary. Each truce will be broken. The enemy will return wearing a new mask. This is why so many feel they are fighting the same battle year after year. They are not fighting the same battle. They are fighting the same enemy on the same wrong battlefield. Only when the ground of the battle shifts from the ego's control to the self's integration can the war truly end. Surrender does not mean inaction. It means aligning with a greater force, drawing upon the deeper currents of the psyche, and allowing the transformation that willpower alone cannot achieve. This is the paradox that every true initiate learns. You win not by gripping tighter, but by opening your hands. The cure does not begin with putting down the glass. It begins with kneeling. Every true initiation, whether in the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, the vision quests of the high plains, or the monastic rites of the desert fathers, begins with a descent. Before the gates of transformation can open, the ego must be stripped bare. The initiate must be brought to a threshold where the old tools, the old defenses, and the old illusions are useless. Carl Jung told the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous that the only cure for chronic alcoholism was a vital spiritual experience, an encounter with a power greater than oneself. This was not a polite suggestion. It was an uncompromising truth. The ordinary resources of the ego could not prevail against the archetypal force of addiction. For the alcoholic, this turning point is the true pivot in the labyrinth. Up until now, every path has led back to the same place: the bar, the bottle, the familiar darkness. But here, for the first time, another door appears. It is not opened by force or cleverness. It opens only to surrender. In myth, surrender is the hero laying down his weapons at the feet of the divine. In alchemical symbolism, it is the solutio, the dissolving of the hardened ego so that a new form can be poured into its place. In psychological terms, it is the collapse of the illusion of self-sufficiency, replaced by a willingness to be reshaped by something greater. The ritual begins in emptiness. No negotiations, no bargains, no half measures. The initiate stands before the unseen presence with hands open and heart unclenched. And in that emptiness, something moves. It may come as a shiver along the spine, as if an unseen wind had passed through the room. It may come as a flood of tears that seem to rise from a place older than memory. It may come as a sudden, unshakable stillness, the eye of a long and violent storm. Or it may come as a simple but overwhelming sense of being seen, not as the drunkard, the failure, the addict, but as the soul that existed before the first wound, before the first drink. This is not the false spirit's rush. It does not blur, it clarifies. It does not burn destructively, it illumines. It does not hollow out, it fills. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, the thirst is understood for what it truly is, a longing for the divine disguised as a craving for intoxication. The bottle was never the destination. It was a crude, distorted map pointing toward a deeper source. This moment is not the end of the journey, but its midpoint, the place where the trajectory shifts from descent to ascent. Having touched the source, the initiate now carries an ember in the chest. The work ahead is learning how to live so that this ember does not go out. Integration begins here. Vision must be made into daily bread. Revelation must be translated into a way of life. In mythic terms, the hero must carry the boon back to the village, not simply for his own benefit, but for the restoration of the community. In psychological terms, the encounter with the self must be woven into the fabric of ordinary life, until the sacred and the mundane are no longer two separate realms. This is why Jung saw recovery as a spiritual process rather than a purely moral or behavioral one. A man can abstain from drink for years and still be spiritually thirsty, still be estranged from his own depths. Sobriety without transformation is little more than a dry desert, a life measured by what is avoided rather than what is lived. The spiritual cure intoxicates without harm. It dissolves the ego yet leaves the soul whole. It burns without consuming. It awakens without overwhelming. And once tasted, it makes the false spirit seem pale and hollow by comparison. But it is not a one-time gift. Like all living things, it must be tended. It requires vigilance, humility, and a continual return to the well. And for the one who tends it faithfully, the reward is not merely the absence of addiction, but the presence of a life that is whole, meaningful, and rooted in the deep ground of the self. In the end, the cure is not about becoming someone entirely new. It is about remembering who you were before you forgot yourself. It is about returning to the original breath, the spiritus that was there before the first sip and will remain after the last. Every true journey ends where it began, but the traveler does not return unchanged. He comes back carrying something invisible, yet undeniable, a new center of gravity, a new way of inhabiting himself. For the alcoholic who has crossed the desert of thirst, descended into the shadow, surrendered to the true spirit, there comes a day when the mirror no longer lies. The fractured reflection, once split between the part that wanted to live and the part that wanted to disappear, begins to merge. In Jung's language, this is the moment of individuation. It is the recognition that the self, the totality of the psyche, is both the seeker and the sought, both the wound and the healer, both the thirst and the water. The circle closes. Reunion with the self is rarely a blinding ecstasy. More often it is a deep settling, a profound alignment. Like a ship finding its true course after years of drifting, the inner war quiets. The once bitter voices that battled inside begin to harmonize. The soul takes its rightful seat at the center of the psyche, not as a tyrant over the ego, but as its guiding presence. In myth, this is the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of opposites. In alchemical symbolism, it is the conjunction, the union of the sun and moon, gold and silver, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. It is the reconciliation of the polarities that once tore the self apart. For the recovering alcoholic, this may feel like a soft but unshakable wholeness. The part that once sought annihilation no longer stands against the part that sought life. They are no longer adversaries but allies, both working toward the same aim: to live truthfully, fully, and in communion with the deeper self. The self does not erase the past. Instead, it gathers it. Every broken promise, every night of despair, every failed attempt, and weaves it into a tapestry of meaning. In this weaving, shame becomes understanding, loss becomes a teacher. Even the years of destruction become part of the myth of transformation, like the dark chapters in a hero's epic that give the light its weight. In alchemical art, the moment of wholeness is often depicted as a king and queen merging into an androgynous figure, a symbol that the divisions within have been reconciled. Psychologically, this means the conscious mind is no longer at war with the unconscious. The energies that were once projected outward in blame or inward in self-loathing are now reintegrated, available for creation, service, and love. Jung emphasized that individuation is not a luxury for the few but a necessity for all who wish to live fully. Without it, the soul remains divided, forever seeking wholeness in false places, whether in the bottle, in compulsive achievement, or in endless distractions. With it, the need for those false refuges fades, not through willpower, but through the natural satisfaction of a thirst that has finally been quenched at its true source. This is the point where the journey changes shape. The path ahead is no longer a desperate struggle for survival. It becomes a creative pilgrimage, the work of building a life that embodies the truths discovered in the depths. The healed man becomes a bridge. He carries water from the source he has found to others still wandering in the desert. His life becomes the cup he once sought in vain. And because the self is not selfish, his healing radiates outward, offering hope not through words alone, but through the quiet authority of a life transformed. This is why, in so many myths, The hero must return to the village after finding the treasure. The journey is never only about the self, it is about what the self can now give. The treasure of individuation is not meant to be hidden. It is meant to nourish the collective, to water the dry places in other hearts. And so the self, once buried under layers of pain, fear, and intoxication, stands revealed, not as a distant deity to be worshipped, but as the eternal companion who never left. It was there in the moments of despair, in the reckless grasping for the bottle, in the surrender to the true spirit. It was there before the first wound, before the first drink. The journey to reunite with the self is the journey home. And home is not merely a place. It is a state of being, Wes. A deep, unshakable knowledge that you are whole, that you belong to yourself, and that nothing essential was ever truly lost. Do not despise the one who is still lost in the bottle, for in his ruin lies a mirror. And if you dare to look, you may see yourself. The alcoholic's struggle is not some exotic pathology isolated from the rest of human life. It is simply a visible form of a condition we all share. Every human being has a cup they lift when the thirst for meaning grows unbearable. For some, it is filled with alcohol. For others, it is filled with ambition, control, distraction, love, pleasure, or the endless glow of a screen. We all have our false spirits. Carl Jung wrote that what we reject in others is often a reflection of what we cannot face in ourselves. The addiction we point to in the alcoholic is but an outer expression of the same inner hunger that drives kings to conquest, lovers to obsession, and ordinary people to waste their years in quiet desperation. The thirst is universal, and so is the possibility of redemption. If you are listening to these words, perhaps you have felt it, that ache that is not in the body, but in the center of your being. Perhaps you have tried to silence it with your own cup. You may even have succeeded for a while, but the thirst always returns. Know this, the thirst is not your enemy. It is your compass. It points to the deep well that never runs dry. The danger is not in feeling it. The danger is in misunderstanding what it is asking for. The shadow would have you mistake the signpost for the destination. It would have you drink from the wrong well until your lips are cracked and your soul is faint. But the true spirit waits, patient and unchanging, in the quiet depths. It does not force itself upon you. It simply calls, through longing, through dreams, through the small moments of grace that pierce the fog. One day, whether in this life or the next, you will answer that call. And when you do, you will discover that the well was never far away. It was always within you. If these words have stirred something in you, a recognition, a memory, a longing, do not let it slip back into the shadows. Do not let this moment dissolve into just another passing thought. Look at your own life. What cup do you lift when the thirst grows sharp? What do you turn to in the quiet hours when no one is watching? This is not about judgment. This is about truth. If you see yourself in this story, even in part, take one step today toward the deeper well. That step might be a conversation with someone you trust. It might be setting down the cup, even for one night. It might be sitting in silence long enough to hear what the thirst is really saying. And if you know someone who is still lost in their own desert, share this message with them, not as a weapon, not as a lecture, but as a lantern in the dark. Your story matters. Your thirst matters. And the world needs people who have found the well, not for their own sake alone, but because others are still searching. The world is thirsty. Carry the cup. Offer it freely. And when you drink from it yourself, remember, you are not simply quenching your own thirst. You are taking part in the great work of making the world whole.